Um, Good morning, everybody, again. I'm your host for this second segment. My name is Megan, just in case you forgot. Not that you need to remember. And welcome to Doxacon 2021, if this is the first session you're logging in for. This is the Hopepunk Theology session, and I'd like to welcome Reverend Paul Schneider and Reverend Mindi, Welton, Michell. In case you're just joining us now, just so you know, you can make comments in the chat window. Keep them relevant and keep them appropriate, please. If you have any questions about the talk, please drop them into the Q&A window, and those will be answered at the end of the talk. But you can type your questions at any time. And also, there should be an upvote function if you're particularly interested in somebody's question. And that'll kind of help us gauge interest as we go forward. If you're having any technical issues, please use the raise hand function, or you can use chat to directly message me, and I will do what I can to help fix the problem. And now I'd particularly like to welcome our presenters, Reverend Paul Schneider. He's a lifelong American Baptist and a lifelong fan of sci-fi, fantasy, and gaming of all kinds. He's a graduate of the Berkeley School of Theology. His master's project was about the intersections of ministry and fanish culture, fan-ish culture. He is the pastor of Burien Community Church in Burien, Washington. And the Reverend Mindi Welton Michell writes science fiction and fantasy under the name Melinda Michell in Seattle, where she lives with her husband and son. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Creative Writing from Linfield College and a Master of Divinity degree from Andover Newton Theological School. Her first novel, Next of Kin, a retelling of the biblical story of Ruth as a fast-paced space adventure, is debuting with Mad Raptor Productions this year, 2021. Her short fiction debut is from B Cubed Press in Tales from the Space Force with her short story Space Force Chaplain. And that's due to be published by the end of 2020. So that's already out. That's
actually it got delayed since that was published. So that's a correction. It should be out in the next month or so. But
that's awesome. Cool. If you have links to that, please put it in the Discord so we can go check it out.
Will do.
Awesome. And besides writing fiction, she is the co-creator of Hopepunk Theology with Reverend Paul, and she blogs weekly at Revolution. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but there are some dashes in there. Okay, perfect. Thank you guys both so much for being here, and I'm going to hand everything over to you guys.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you, Doxacon, for having us. I'm just going to share briefly that Paul and I have presented before together. We have presented at the American Baptist Theologians Conference. And in 2017, it was the first time we presented together on a paper called Digital Space as Sacred Space. And it's interesting because we received some pushback on that paper, and I'm safe to say in the last year we have proved everybody wrong that digital space is indeed sacred space. So welcome to this sacred space. And then Paul and I collaborated once again on this presentation, Hopepunk Theology, which we gave in 2019 in Virginia Beach. And I'm going to turn it over to Paul, and he can share how this idea got started and begin our Hopepunk Theology.
On Tumblr in 2017, an author named Alexandra Rowland posted, "The opposite of grimdark is hopepunk. Pass it on." They were drawing attention to the popular genre of grimdark and also pointing out how necessary it is to have a counterbalance to that narrative of selfishness and hopelessness. Hopepunk is more than just a conjoining of two words. It is the naming of a type of story that exists both in fiction and in history, both in mythology and in our social environment. In a follow-up post, Alexandra Rowland defined the term more completely and mentioned both fictional characters and real people who would be considered hopepunk. As Baptist pastors, our attention was piqued when we saw Jesus Christ and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were on that list.
And I can tell you, I think we both read the article about the same time, and I posted it on Facebook, tagged Paul, and did the hashtag Hopepunk Theology, and that's how this was born. But before we get to Hopepunk, it's helpful for us to consider previous works on theology and media. The author Anthony Bartlett wrote a book called Virtually Christian: How Christ Changes Human Being and Makes Creation New in 2009. And I will post these resources. And also Paul has a bibliography for Hopepunk that we will post in the Discord later. In this book, Virtually Christian, Anthony Bartlett explores the work of the cross in cinema and popular music through the lens of nonviolent atonement and the work of René Girard. Bartlett argues that it is not possible to see the signs of the cross in media without the work of the cross. We cannot view film and literature representations of sacrifice to save others without thinking of Jesus on the cross. Bartlett's work leads us to Hopepunk theology. However, while Bartlett takes on Girard's view through nonviolence, Hopepunk is focused on resistance through weaponized optimism. The language of violence is transformed into a language of resistance, similar to the armor of God found in Ephesians chapter 6. Hopepunk theology builds on this previous work of Anthony Bartlett. The genre of Hopepunk is not without violence, but Hopepunk theology is built on the force of optimism and hope that comes through the work of Jesus and the signs we see in cinema and literature of this genre of the cross and resistance. In the words of a colleague of mine, Reverend Rebecca Sumner, who serves in Everett, Washington, we find Easter eggs all around. And as you may know, Easter eggs is a term used in media to refer to hidden messages, clues, or inside jokes that the viewer will understand if they've read or seen more in that genre. In this case, the Easter egg is the Easter story, the gospel, and resistance.
In order for us to better understand Hopepunk, let's talk about some foundational definitions, not just of the grimdark milieu, but also of the punk antecedents to Hopepunk. Grimdark is a really popular type of story these days, particularly since 2001. Grimdark storytelling has been on a huge upswing. It certainly existed before that, just as Hopepunk stories existed before Rowland coined the term. The basic argument of the grimdark genre is that human nature is essentially bad. People are selfish and self-interested, and all things being equal, more likely to do terrible things which advance a personal motive than to do something positive to help others. Many grimdark stories have equally grim settings. The world is a dark and dangerous place, hope is lost, and violent and disturbing actions are common and presented in excruciating detail. Dystopian stories, usually about futures where survivors stand in the ashes of fallen civilizations, oppressed by a powerful few with no chance of an improvement, are not just popular in young adult fiction these days. You see them in television, in books, and movies aimed at people of all ages. These stories are a reaction to a perceived grimdark world. One need look no further than the horrors of Syria and Myanmar, famine across the world, the resurgence of white nationalism, not just in our own country, but across Europe, and the violent insurrection in the US Capitol in an attempt to overthrow our government, to see why the world seems to fall into this grim, dark category. In a grim, dark worldview, things will not get better, only worse. People will always make essentially selfish decisions, and systems and structures will continually fail us. Starting in the late 1970s, a type of story which came to be called cyberpunk arose. This term comes from a vision of the future where technology is a defining feature of human life, which was then combined with the ideals of the punk movement. Today, known best for the eponymous music it engendered, the punk movement is about resistance, resisting both cultural norms and the oppression of governments and societies against the most marginalized people. Identifiable by their distinct sense of style, punks were some of the most effective political activists of the 80s and 90s by putting their message in their music and then matching it with direct action in the streets. Resistance is at the heart of the punk worldview. Cyberpunk futures are most often dystopian futures ruled by corporations rather than nations, where the wealth gap between the poor and the rich is so wide as to be unbridgeable, where technology might improve lives, but is also used to keep watch on the civilian populace and make sure that corporations profited, and that the will of the corporations is enforced by semi-governmental mercenaries bought and paid for politicians. The protagonists of the novels were almost always where the punk part comes in. They're the ones who resist these systems in direct and indirect ways. I think it's worth noting that the author William Gibson, one of the earliest writers to have this label cyberpunk put on his work, no longer allows his work to be called science fiction or cyberpunk by his publishers. In Gibson's view, the reality of today is well on its way to being the world he wrote about. Perhaps because of the popularity of the term cyberpunk, several other punk genres have arisen. Sometimes these are defined by cultures or people groups, as in Afropunk. Other times they are defined by broader ethos or focus, such as ecopunk and solarpunk. Other times it is about going retro and imagining a world where technology took a different direction, like steampunk or dieselpunk stories do. One criticism of these terms is that often they are applied to stories to describe aspects of the settings, and the mentality of resistance or opposition to the dominant paradigm of these worlds is not really part of the story. Because resistance is so central to the punk culture's understanding of itself, there's a valid point that the punk label may be misapplied to some of these stories. That criticism is also leveled against the term Hopepunk, however. But resistance is at the core of the Hopepunk ideal. Hopepunk says that kindness and softness don't equal weakness, and that in this world of brutal cynicism and nihilism, being kind is a political act, an act of rebellion. While this is a broad definition, these characteristics are particular to the Hopepunk genre, as noted by Aja Romano in a December 2018 Vox article. Gentleness and kindness, the struggle to build positive social systems, community building through cooperation, not conflict, self-awareness of emotion, showing vulnerability being not only accepted but encouraged, and that anything worth fighting for is worth sacrificing for. Additionally, there is not usually a happy ending, but an understanding that the struggle will always exist, and the courage to keep going anyway. Hopepunk is the opposite of grimdark because it stands for resisting hopeless paradigms and valuing humanity. Another common criticism of Hopepunk is that it's just a stand-in for wholesome. Fred Rogers, better known as Mr. Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, stood for kindness, love, learning, hope, and growing as a person. His work and show inspired generations of children, including the authors of this particular paper. And while Fred Rogers would agree that gentleness and kindness were a choice worth making, he was also willing to stand up to the powerful to benefit the oppressed, especially children, as seen in his testimony before Congress about funding for public broadcasting. Fred Rogers is a real-world Hopepunk figure, but it would be an error to call Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood Hopepunk. Fred Rogers deliberately excluded some of the darker things in order to create a show that was a comfortable space for the children watching. Hopepunk actions and stories don't happen in comfortable spaces. On the other hand, Steve Rogers, a fictional character better known as Captain America, often epitomizes Hopepunk, especially in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In Captain America, the First Avenger, we meet a young Steve Rogers, a skinny and small man who refuses to back down even when he is completely overmatched, because as he says, "I don't like bullies." Upon being transformed bodily to where his physical power matches his moral strength, he doesn't lose any of the kindness or courage that defined him when he lacked the prowess he has been granted. He stands against Nazi Germany and especially the supervillain, the Red Skull, to take out the leadership of the organization Hydra. Frozen for decades as a result of a brave and self-sacrificing act, he returns to our modern world, a hero out of step with time. In Captain America, the Winter Soldier, Steve Rogers learns that in taking out the Red Skull, though he cut the head off of Hydra, true to its name, it simply sprouted more heads. Hydra has become an insidious cancer across the world, but especially in the United States government and its agencies. S.H.I.E.L.D., the very agency meant to protect the world from Hydra, has instead become the eyes, ears, and hands of the monster. In one memorable scene, with all the odds against them, and Hydra poised to claim its greatest victory, This, Mr. Rogers, delivers a compelling speech, inspiring those not working for Hydra to stand against their fellow SHIELD agents to save the world. He warns his fellow agents that Hydra has infiltrated them and nearly gained total control, and that if they fail to stop them, Hydra will have the power to kill anyone who stands in their way. He says, unless we stop them. I know I'm asking a lot, but the price of freedom is high. It always has been. And it's a price I'm willing to pay. And if I'm the only one, then so be it. But I'm willing to bet I'm not. In the end, it's not just Steve Rogers, Captain America, standing against Hydra, but all the people who won't just lie down and let them dominate the world, even if it costs them their lives. Hopepunk in many ways requires the shadow of a grimdark world. It needs something to resist against in order to be Hopepunk. Hopepunk is not utopia. Using broadly Christian theological ideas, we might point out that with Hopepunk mentality, the kingdom is already and not yet. It is already present in the acts of kindness and resistance to evil and empire. It is not yet present in a world that is still a flawed and broken place, where terrible things will still happen. The very act of resistance itself, of striving to create that better world, even though it will never be the completely realized perfect world, is at the heart of the Hopepunk story. Using two more familiar pop culture examples, we could point out that though Discovery and Picard are very Hopepunk stories, most of the rest of Star Trek is not Hopepunk. A significant measure of utopia has been achieved in that universe. But Star Wars usually is. The most recent trilogy of Star Wars movies being evidence that even after overcoming the evil empire, there's no happily ever after in the offing for the characters or their universe.
While Hopepunk, as author Kat Rambo stated, is a reaction of our times, she posted that in 2019, we find that the roots of Hopepunk are in our scripture. Indeed, most of the authors that blogged about Hopepunk mentioned Jesus, whether they were Christian or not, and cite the work of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as in the line of Hopepunk. To summarize the roots of Hopepunk in scripture, we have focused on three stories: Jeremiah's role before the fall of Jerusalem, Jesus' death and resurrection, and the beginning of the early church in Acts. One of the themes of Hopepunk is resistance to empire, and we could have done an entire presentation on Hopepunk and Revelation, and I'm glad Revelation was mentioned in the previous presentation, as well as prophecy and Jeremiah. We have focused to narrow our focus down to focus on resistance to empire when all hope seems lost in the story of the prophet Jeremiah. When the prophet was a young boy, God spoke to him and said, "See, today I appoint you over nations and over kingdoms, to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant." And that's Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 10. From the beginning, Jeremiah's role was to speak on behalf of God, that the empires of this world will fall, and often in bleak, grim, dark terms. The prophet was even locked up in the stocks for prophesying against his own king. He prophesies the siege of Jerusalem by Babylon, and in the middle of that battle, when all hope seems lost, God tells Jeremiah to buy a field. Even though the enemy is upon them and the empire has come, Jeremiah buys a field from his cousin, signs the deed, has it sealed, and tucks it away safe in an earthenware jar, because this is from Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 15. "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, houses and fields and vineyards shall again be bought in this land." Jeremiah speaks to a resurrection hope, that the worst thing happening to his people in that time was not the last thing. God would bring them home out of exile. And in the following verses, Jeremiah recalls how God delivered the people from Egypt. We know that the kings and the officials didn't listen to Jeremiah. Those who fought back were killed, and the leaders did not turn from their ways. However, we also know that a few generations later, some of the exiles did return, the hope fulfilled. The parallel story for Jeremiah in recent fiction of an empire utterly crushing a rebellion and forcing some of its own prophets to go into exile is in Star Wars, specifically Rogue One. The Jedi have gone into exile with the rise of Darth Vader, and the Emperor's Death Star is about to wreak havoc on the galaxy. And while the famous saying that many of us know from that movie is rebellions are built on hope, the rebellion at this point is not a violent revolution to save the people, except for maybe Saw Gerrera's group, but a last desperate attempt for a future hope. The plans for the Death Star to stop the weapon of mass destruction, to the point that Jyn Erso and Cassian Andor sacrificed their own lives to save the rest of the galaxy. Jeremiah did not live to see the remnant return, nor did Jyn and Cassian know for certain that their attempt to transmit the plans of the weakness in the Death Star made it to the Alliance. However, Jeremiah lived with the assurance of God's promise in chapter 29, verse 11, of a future with hope. He lived with that future, that hope would be fulfilled. At the end of Rogue One, the expressions on Jyn and Cassian on their faces before the shockwave from the Death Star hits them convey that satisfaction, that hope has lived, that the worst of the Empire would not have the final word. If Rogue One is too bleak of an example, another one that parallels the ridiculousness of Jeremiah's message of hope in the midst of a siege and buying this field is perhaps the dance scene at the end of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1. While we could have chosen any of the movies from the Marvel Cinematic Universe for Hopepunk themes, it's that scene of Peter Quill, also known as Star-Lord, stepping in front of the Conqueror Ronan, who is about to wipe an entire planet out of existence. It seems reminiscent of Jeremiah in the King's prison buying a field. Peter is, of course, reenacting a scene from Footloose in order to distract Ronan. The dance-off distraction works, and Peter grabs the Infinity Stone, which should have killed him. Instead, his friends take his hand, helping to spread the power of the Infinity Stone among them, and they all survive. Now, if you've seen Volume 2 and the rest of the MCU, you know why Peter was able to survive that. But if you hadn't seen the rest of it, it's very powerful in this moment where his friends take on that power, and together they help stop Ronan. In a similar manner, Jeremiah urges the people going into exile that there is hope if they band together, wherever they land in exile. After 28 chapters of doom and gloom from Jeremiah's mouth, suddenly we find words of comfort. Jeremiah tells the people that though they are being taken into exile, God has said to them, buy houses, plant gardens, get married and have children, even in exile, to give you a future with hope. Staying together as community, sharing in the suffering of being in exile, they will know that they are not alone and they will survive together. Another theme that emerges in the resistance to empire is the theme that death does not have the final word. As shared in the example of Rogue One, the willingness to lay down one's life for the greater good is a common theme of Hopepunk, and of course central to the story of Jesus. Jesus' death and resurrection defies the weapon of choice of the Roman Empire, the cross of crucifixion, and utterly turns it into a symbol of hope and resistance to empire. N.K. Jemison's The Broken Earth trilogy, and I saw there was a little bit in Discord earlier about this, beginning with the 5th season, is a heartbreaking story of resistance to an empire that enslaved those who were different, those who possessed the power of orogeny to quell earthquakes and volcanoes, or cause them. The story begins with the ending of the empire, and in turn the ending of the world, with one person rebelling against this injustice, causing a geological disaster of epic proportions. However, it turns out the world can still be saved, but not without sacrifice. As Mary washed her only son upon the cross, who gives of himself to save the world, in the Broken Earth series, it is a mother who sacrifices herself in the very work of orogeny, the power that she has been forced to use for the empire, so that her daughter can save the world. In the final scenes, a son, the mother, has become a new creation, but it turns out that new creation is very much rooted in who her people used to be, returning to her created intention. A final theme that we want to focus on for this presentation is that the crux of Hopepunk theology and scripture is weaponized optimism. We find that in the Acts of the Apostles, it is a particularly upbeat book of the Bible, despite the martyrdom of many early Christian leaders and Paul's imprisonment. When Stephen is about to be stoned in Acts 8, he cries out a message of hope. Look, I have seen the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. Stephen never renounces his belief in Christ, even at the point of death. And right after this chapter, as you probably know, is the story of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. Both Peter and Paul face imprisonment, threats against their lives, violence, rejection, even at times divisions among themselves. However, the writer of Acts continues to keep hope alive with an optimistic tone, and the message repeated over and over again, first by Peter and then by Paul, is that Jesus who was killed rose again. Even when they are in prison, their jailers hear this message and believe. This optimism, this hope cannot be stopped in the early church. This weaponized optimism defies death and imprisonment, evil and empire. Oscar-winning director Guillermo del Toro writes that optimism is radical. It is the hard choice, the brave choice. And it is, it seems to me, most needed now. He was writing this in 2019. History and fable have both proven that nothing is ever entirely lost. Again, this is Guillermo del Toro saying, David can take on Goliath. A beach in Normandy can turn the tide of the war. Bravery can topple the powerful. These facts are often seen as exceptional, but they are not. Every day, we all become the balance of our choices between love and fear, belief or despair. No hope is ever too small. And again, we'll have that listed in our bibliography because it's such a powerful quote. Acts of the Apostles also shows us that the marginalization of others is the work of the empire, and to resist empire is to resist oppression and marginalization. Priscilla, Lydia, Damaris, and Dorcas, also known as Tabitha, who is given the title disciple, are all leaders in the early church. The Ethiopian eunuch, baptized by Philip, was both an ethnic and sexual minority who would have been barred from temple worship. Peter's own vision of inclusion for the centurion Cornelius broke open the dividing walls for all Gentiles. The gospel continues to be shared with hope despite the persecution of the early church faced. We see this weaponized optimism and work of inclusion in another Star Wars film, The Last Jedi. There was much resistance to this film, both its message of hope and its diverse cast, by those who stated that the message of The Last Jedi was too weak, too feminine, too focused on love. A blog post on Canada Press states that Hopepunk contains a weaponized aesthetic of softness, wholesome or cuteness, and maybe a temper of consciously chosen gentleness. The Last Jedi has porgs, a cute little bird-like creature. My son has an actual porg toy that squawks when you squeeze it. It's very cute. Luke Skywalker, the former Jedi, drinks milk right from the breast of a creature. And Rose Tico, a new character in that movie, has the quote of the movie. We're going to win this war not by fighting what we hate, but by saving those we love. Luke Skywalker wins the battle in the end by not fighting at all. Unfortunately, there is resistance to this weaponized optimism of Hopepunk. The actress who played Rose Tico, Kelly Marie Tran, was bullied off of social media because some fans, we put in quotation marks, felt her character was too soft and distracting from the other male character, Finn. Other fans boycotted the movie because they didn't like what happened to Luke. Hopepunk rejects toxic masculinity. N.K. Jemisin, the Hugo Award-winning author of the Broken Earth trilogy that we mentioned earlier, was the first Black woman to receive that award and the first author ever to three-peat, she received threats of violence for this. And the Hugo Awards themselves were boycotted by white male fans and authors. However, Jemisin's 2018 win turned a second of convergence during which literary Hopepunk developed into real-world activism, a present of defiance in an ongoing battle in opposition to radical right-wing extremism inside the sci-fi fantasy neighborhood. In recognizing her work with its themes of discovering humanity and love amid apocalyptic change, Hugo voters dispatched a message that they'd not permit blights like racism to undermine the sci-fi neighborhood's humanism and idealism. Just as the overall genre of punk erased gender norms and boundaries, remember the 1980s? So too do current authors, creators, and artists and actors of Hope Punk shift our stereotypes. The early church subverted those norms with women leaders, welcoming Gentiles, practicing loving kindness and hospitality, and sharing what they had with those in need because of Jesus, who had given his life for the sake of the world. They even co-opted the terms of the empire, transforming the term good news from a victory of conquering Rome to the gospel, the good news of God's love for all people. Returning to examples from Jesus' own life, where Jesus tells the disciples to welcome the little children and not to stop them, where Jesus tells the disciples that if they wish to enter the kingdom of heaven, they must become like a little child. Hope Punk has surged in children's literature and cartoons. We have noticed a shift in children's cartoons to focus on bravery that does not sacrifice friendship, love, and kindness. The new She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, a reboot of the 80s children's show, is specifically Hope Punk. The 80s cartoon, while having a female heroine, had clear divisions of who was good and who was evil. Good people had friends, and those friends never fought except against evil. And evil was simply the angry horde that wanted to conquer Etheria. The only ones who cried were the losers. In the new She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, Adora and her friends, a much more diverse cast than the original, struggle in their friendships. They show their emotions. They sometimes cry, and they reach out to each other. They fight against the horde that is destroying the environment around them, but some of their friends have become part of the horde, and they encounter the difficulties of navigating former friendships when in deep disagreement. In these cartoons, both boys and girls are capable of love, feeling sad, and having deep friendships. And one thing we also noticed is there's the character Double Trouble, who is non-binary. And while that character sometimes seems good, sometimes seems evil, no matter what happens, no one in the story misgenders them. That's an important aspect of Hope Punk. Friendships are placed in high regard, as is repairing the relationship when it is strained when it is possible. This emphasis on love, friendship, and restoration, with the character Bo often shouting out "best friend squad" when they face evil, is their weaponized optimism. Becoming like a child is taking on that hopeful optimism in spite of what the world teaches us. Hope Punk is teaching adults that children aren't always naive, but can still maintain that hopeful optimism that friendship is hard but worth it, and that all might enter the reign of God.
Hope Punk might have been named now, but has existed since the beginning, like Tabitha being the first woman called a disciple, but the women before her were certainly also disciples. In some ways, Hope Punk is almost too broad of a definition. The question is asked in several of the articles we read for this paper, but isn't everything Hope Punk? One could say the same thing of the gospel, but isn't everything good news? Doesn't all of creation speak to us of the goodness of our God? Hope Punk stories have existed before the term was coined, but the fact that they are becoming more prominent now speaks not just to the situation of the world and our society, but to what the people of today are reacting against. Andrew Slack, a comedian and activist, founder of the Harry Potter Alliance, framed it this way when pointing to the successes his organization has had. The truly radical thing we've done is show that fantasy is not an escape from our world, but an invitation to go deeper into it. By encouraging young people to be like the heroes they read about, this enthusiastic generation really can change the world. Likewise, in the shadow of the aftermath of the seditious riot in our capital, during the inauguration, Amanda Gorman's poem, The Hill We Climb, was Hope Punk articulated, reminding us that the light is always there if we are brave enough to see it, if we are brave enough to be it. What is Hope Punk theology then? Hope Punk theology is weaponized optimism and resistance to empire. Hope Punk is not utopia. Hope Punk rather is the already not yet of the kingdom, the beloved community, the reign of God. We see it, experience it, and participate in the reign of God, but we know that the fruition is still to come. We know that the empire may have us surrounded, but we resist not with violence, but with hope. We resist with love. We resist with gentleness and kindness, the fruits of the Spirit. We resist empire by rejecting toxic masculinity, choosing a Savior who told his disciples to put away the sword, who went willingly to the cross, who chose death as resistance rather than violence. In Jesus' death, he saved those he loved, all of us.
I think we're ready for some questions.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. And we've got some really interesting questions over here too. So without further ado, Roy asks, have you heard of the Japanese genre of Honobono? And if so, how has it informed your work?
I don't think I've ever heard that term before today, but Roy, I'll definitely be looking into that because it sounds like you are drawing a connection there. I'd be interested to see where that might lead us.
And I think that's one thing is we're still working with primarily Western sources for the most part, although we are Nnedi Okorafor and others are drawing us into Africa futurism too, but we're always expanding this, especially the bibliography. So we love hearing more.
Awesome. Yeah. Roy, throughout the day, like if you want to put in any resources, yeah, we'd love to hear more about it. Robert asks, if punk implies resistance to something, is there a role for good or virtuous institutions in Hopepunk? Or does Hopepunk presume a setting in which all institutions are corrupt and only individuals can stand against them? For example, in Star Wars, the rebellion and or resistance seem to be institutions of hope that raise up individual heroes, but they are also corrupt as implied. But are they also corrupt as implied in Rogue One and The Force Awakens?
That's a really good question, and I think what we see in the Hopepunk genre is even when the good institutions rise. I mean, that's why we had to, when we first presented this. Picard and Discovery weren't out yet, and we've had to add those in because Picard starts questioning the institution, right? Starts questioning the Federation and the goodness that we have taken for granted since the original series. So that's a really good question. And is it because and if it's because our institutions are still human based, then there is, definitely, I think, it's hard to see an institution that doesn't get corrupt. But that's at least in my view, is that eventually, we've seen that with the church, unfortunately, church in general terms. But Paul, I don't know if you want to add.
No, I mean, that's more or less what I was going to bring up is that even the church is not above, sort of corruption or falling prey to some of these forces from within our culture that limit its effectiveness, limit its message.
All right. Tanya asks, I'm seeing a similar Hopepunk theme between the three Pentecosts in Acts, Christ's Jewish followers, then the Samaritans, then Gentiles, and the reimagining of the Jedi in The Last Jedi. Concentric expanding circles of inclusion and empowerment. What other stories, movies, shows do you see with this Pentecostal inclusion? Babylon 5?
So that's a really good question. I certainly think we actually see that in a lot of the Hopepunk literature, a lot of the Hopepunk shows. We see this too. Actually, She-Ra and the Princesses of Power is a great example of this because the circle of who are the Princesses of Power keeps expanding, and then sometimes actually contracts. Right? People shift their alliances and their allegiances, and then take those ideals to the other side. And that actually causes change even on the evil side of things. So the power and the optimism that one character wields, even if she's not terribly well understood, sometimes can just transform even the darkest of places.
And I would definitely say there's probably more books, movies, games, comics that we have not explored. I mean, so many times Paul and I would be talking and he would mention something and be like, oh, I haven't watched that yet, or I haven't read that yet. So definitely, like, if you see this in other things, that's the kind of stuff, and we'll share in the Discord, but we have a Hopepunk Theology Facebook page, as well as a gathering once a month. And we were meeting at what it's now Distant Worlds Coffee House. It was Wayward Coffee House once a month, and then with COVID, we've moved online for a once a month Zoom gathering. But we love having people add more stuff because, we're just people that don't have time to watch everything. So some of you have more stories and more background and knowledge, and especially ideas. And thank you for the definition of hope. I'm not going to say it right, but thank you for that, because there are probably more sources and things that we can add to this growing idea of Hopepunk theology.
All right. Robert asks another question, and it's, is Hopepunk a kind of dramatization of the idea that the best way to defeat your enemy is to turn them into a friend?
I don't know that that's always the case. Sometimes you do have to face your enemy in direct opposition. Certainly in Hopepunk stories, there is a level of conflict, right? And sometimes just out and out defeating your opponent is the only way forward. But it's usually a last resort, right? You do everything you can to avoid the ultimate violent ending. I think Avatar: The Last Airbender is actually a really good example of this. And without giving anything away, I can say that those characters regularly look for those other options rather than just resorting to sort of drastic and final solutions.
And thank you for not giving. I'm just watching Avatar for the first time, and Paul knows that. So I'm finishing season 1 with my son. So thank you for the notes. I know we gave some spoilers for N.K. Jemisin earlier and stuff, but thank you for not spoiling it for me. But yeah, I mean, just to add to that, with She-Ra and the Princesses of Power, I think Adora sets a boundary with Catra. Like, she sets a boundary, and Catra keeps trying to cross those boundaries. And that sometimes you have to set a boundary when you are going to be in physical harm, emotional harm, mental, spiritual harm. You do have to set boundaries to protect yourself. But it doesn't mean that Adora doesn't keep trying to reach Catra in different ways. But she does, she does set boundaries, and you have to do that at times to protect yourself.
Yeah. Congratulations on watching Avatar. I'm so jealous that you get to watch it for the first time, and I'll never get to watch it for the first time again. Anyway, Emmanuel asks, where do you see secular Hopepunk and Christian Hopepunk theology deviating in particularly meaningful ways?
I mean, for me, the line comes down to being willing to inflict violence. I mean, I think as Christians, one of the things that Reverend Mindi and I are particularly committed to is the idea of nonviolent resistance. And while there are definitely people who have different interpretations of what that means across the Christian spectrum, that's sort of where we draw that line. I do think that that in secular Hopepunk works, you do find violence used as a solution, maybe a little bit more often than even we would like. But as we pointed out, the end of The Last Jedi, and I don't feel like I'm giving anything away. If you've missed it, that's on you. I'm sorry. But it, one of the things that we pointed out is Luke Skywalker wins that fight by not even fighting at all, right? It's a completely nonviolent resistance, even though his opponent doesn't realize that, right? And to me, that was actually one of the most sort of significant moments in that movie, and for me, the thing that really showed that he had truly achieved that level of Jedi master, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the things too with our Hopepunk theology conversations that we've expanded. As you know, Reverend Paul and I are both Christian and Protestants. So we have a specific worldview, but we have expanded our conversations online and in our gatherings to people of different religious backgrounds. And we have a rabbi who joins in our conversations a lot, which is awesome. But we've also had polytheist folks who have joined in, and obviously we're going to have very different understanding of our faith, and so there are some places where it's more universal than places where for us the Easter eggs literally are the Easter story.
Beautiful, thank you. And Elizabeth asks, wondering whether you can apply this term hope punk to authors from before the punk era, like, for example, Wrinkle in Time.
I mean, I definitely think so. I mean, one of the things that was really interesting to me was that when Alexandra Rowland, who created the term, when they were looking at these ideas, they definitely looked at older stories, including the Gospels, including real world figures like Dr. King, and so this idea does transcend that. I agree. I find that the Wrinkle in Time series definitely falls into that hope punk line pretty well. The Lord of the Rings, there are parts of Lord of the Rings that are very hope punk. The Sam and Frodo story is very, very hope punk. The idea that it was the smallest people who were going to have the biggest impact is very hope punk. Some people argue that the Lord of the Rings, particularly when it comes to Aragorn, is actually a noble bright story, and there's some differences between noble bright and hope punk. Generally speaking, in noble bright, once the king is restored to the throne or the right ruler is in place, everything becomes okay again. So,
and hope punk really does focus on the people who maybe didn't have power and were the nobodies. So, like, you know, the hobbits were the nobodies in that in the world and in Middle Earth, and so, you know, Aragorn, who was supposedly the rightful king, is not a nobody. I mean, at first Strider, but then, yeah. So, and it's one of those things where there's going to be stories that people will argue one way or another. Some people argue that the Broken Earth series is not hope punk, and so there's some different, you know, there's some tension in there that we just kind of live with.
I think we have time for one more question, and Roy has two. One of them is about online gatherings that aren't Facebook, so maybe that's best left for the Discord chat. But he has a question about nobledark and how is it different from hope punk?
I'm not familiar with noble dark as a term, but if you meant noble bright stories are very focused on sort of the idea that once the right people are in charge or ascend to control, that the evil is vanquished, that the land is restored. You know, the King Arthur story is always a noble bright story, right? The land is falling into ruin, and then he draws the sword from the stone, and behold, Camelot, right? I mean, and yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but not a lot. And the same thing with Aragorn in the Lord of the Rings series. Yeah, the whole story is about defeating Sauron, but once he's restored to the throne, everything seems to be fixed, and all of the horror of what came before kind of gets brushed under the rug. And that's really typical in noble bright stories, where hope punk stories tend to be a bit more realistic about, you know, kind of the problems and the lasting effects of having a pretty negative world that you are pushing back against.
So I just thought he meant noble dark, and he's got some more things in there. That's not something we've explored. Obvious by the way we're answering. I just Googled and saw, oh, there is a term noble dark. We didn't know that term before, so.
And one of the, I don't know if the Discord is going to be continuing after the convention. If it's going to remain open, then we actually do our gatherings by Zoom. So the Facebook page is where we post our information about the gathering, but we do our gatherings by Zoom, and we can post those links in the Hopepunk Theology group on the Discord page for our next meeting, which will be on the 3rd.
Yeah, we meet the first Wednesday of the month at 6 p.m. Pacific. And also the Facebook, because it's a page, it is public, so you don't have to have Facebook. You can just put it in your browser and you can still reach it that way without having to have a Facebook account. So.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us in this session. Yeah, continue to ask questions in Discord, and we'll see you guys in the next meeting.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us. This was so fun.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. This was an awesome talk. I'm so intrigued.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you.